Hi there, and welcome to today's episode of How the Game Was Won. Today we'll be looking at the one and only decisive game from round 8 of the FIDE Grand Prix, currently underway in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. This game was played on the 29th of October 2014. As I mentioned, with the white pieces is Boris Gelfand, and with the black pieces Jobava. Now, it's important to note that with this game that Jobava won, he was able to move up to a share of the joint lead with just 3 rounds to go in the tournament, which is a really good spot to be in. Whereas by way of the loss, Gelfand cemented his position down at the bottom of the table. Without further ado, let me go through a couple of the opening moves and then get to a couple of the really interesting positions as they develop throughout the game. Gelfand opened with d4, with a response of e6, c4, b6, e4, bishop b7. And in this situation is, although it started off with a really unusual type of d4 type of response, the type of position that we're moving into now is not as uncommon as people think. I mean, to my mind, with your b6 bishop b7 combination, it's starting to resemble almost a little bit of a Queen's Indianish type of setup. But anyway, let's continue to get to some of the really interesting positions. White continued with bishop d3, bishop b4 check, again very Queen's Indianish. Bishop d2, bishop takes, knight takes, d6 for black. Surprisingly enough, black is probably okay here. He will have a space disadvantage, but he'll slowly develop all of his pieces to good squares, and his position is essentially very solid. White continued here with f4, we got knight d7, queen g4. The aggressive move here is obviously not very well prepared and something that was found across the board, and it's overextending himself a little bit already, especially considering that White's knight is still pegged all the way back on g1, and White's king is still trapped in the middle of the board. So personally, I would be looking at working my way to some degree of king safety before making a sortie like this with the queen. The game continued with knight gf6. Obviously the queen makes a brilliant target, and queen takes pawn, rook g8, queen h6, rook takes g2. In this position, for instance, another possible alternative would be the really interesting e5, which could lead to a really interesting and sharp game. But either which way, black played rook takes g2, which then meant that white is now coming up out with his knight gf3. And bearing in mind now with the rook capture, it means that both sides of the board, the king is obviously way exposed, and with the black rook controlling the g-file so spectacularly, that obviously makes a kingside castle totally out of the question for the moment. So in all likelihood, the castle is going to be coming towards the queen side, but that will still leave white with the nagging hole sitting here on the c2 c3 squares. Black continued with queen e7, queen h3, rook g7, and as we expected, white castles long. But even though white's castled long, I would still feel really uncomfortable about the hole in c2. And white continued knight g4. So black continued with knight g4. The other alternative on move 13 might have been castling long with rook h to g1, double up the rooks, and rook g5, which would give a slight advantage to white. But instead, black played knight g4, forcing queen g3, and knight d to f6. And white's queen over here is in a surprisingly awkward position. I mean, the immediate threats that we have going at the moment would be, for instance, knight h5, attacking the queen, and followed by, for instance, when the queen moves, you'll be able to follow that by hitting the f4 square, which would leave white in a really precarious situation. So what does white do to deal with these threats? He drops his knight into g5, which really, instead of dropping the knight into g5, he could have played, for instance, queen to e1 to try, because obviously the longer the queen stays out there on the side of the board where black's pieces, minor pieces, are mounting up a really strong challenge, the more awkward and precarious his position will be becoming. Because with dropping the queen back, you can play, after knight h5, you've got f5 as a possibility, which at least gives white a degree of something to do in the situation, rather than at this stage needing to play retreating moves with the queen. But be that as it may, he chose knight g5, and all that happens now is black plays h6, which means that, yes, sure, the knight comes back to h3 to be able to defend the f4 pawn, but really all that's now happened is that white has now trapped a knight off against the edge of the board that won't be able to do all that much going forward. So what does black do here? Castles queenside, with obviously the options being either to bring the rook across to e1, or for that matter double it up on the g file, which will just make way additional pressure on the hapless white queen position. I mean, leaving the queen out there is just making a prime target for attack. So what does white do here? He brings the rook across to from d to e1, trying to, even though it's a completely closed off file, trying to develop some sort of long distance threat down to the king the queen on e7. The game continued, knight h5. We were expecting that to be happening sooner rather than later. Now white tries to do something about the queen, taking it down to f3. Black bangs the queen out to h4, and at the moment it seems like white's position is overextended. He's got obviously a strong central majority with the 4 pawns, but with his pieces sitting in rather awkward and non-cohesive type of positions, it's unlikely that the 4 pawns as well as the queen sitting on f3 will be able to remain strong under the onslaught of a cohesive black positional piece positioning. One possibility for white to be able to do here might be, say for instance, to play the queen back to f1, then obviously the pawn drops, swap the knight off, black drops the knight down to f2, with black having a distinct advantage here, with either an exchange of queens happening on the f2 square, or for that matter the really strong threat against both the rook on h1 and the knight on f4. But instead of playing this, white chose to play rook e2 instead, maybe thinking of backing that up with doubling the rooks to increase some sort of pressure running down the closed off e-file, but really it's a case of, by lifting the rook to e2, he's effectively blocking off possible flight squares for the white queen, which is still way precarious in its current position. So anyway, so with the rook e2, black could continue with king to b8, just gaining a little bit more king security before the possibility of, for instance, opening up the diagonal for the light square bishop to control the diagonal, which will then in the process be able to not only hit the queen but hit the rook at the same time. White continues, bishop c2. Okay, now we're looking at the possibility of flight squares for the queen along the third rank, but really the black's position is just getting stronger and stronger and stronger with each passing move. As I mentioned, now black can play f5, threatening to crack open the way strong h1 a8 diagonal. White drops the queen back to f1, knight on h to f6, another piece hitting the now vulnerable e4 square, and although black is playing the simplest of moves and is able to do so because of Gelfand's uncohesive piece positioning and overextended pawn center, just will now be able to be collapsing under its own weight. White continues with knight f3. Again, still a lack of total cohesion amongst the pieces, and white in its position now already at move 22 is needing to defend all over the place. Black continues queen h5. White takes on e with ef. Black takes ef. Now that e4 is cleared, as I mentioned, black's position really comes into its own with the controlling of that way strong diagonal. White plays d5 to try and close it down. Black goes rook e8, rook takes, queen takes, queen d3, trying for some degree of activity against the black's weakened f5 pawn, but really it's all over by the shouting, because once we double up the rook onto the open file, white comes in with rook f1. Now you play knight e3, which neatly forks the rook and bishop. Rook has to come to f2, bishop a6, now hitting the c4 pawn, bishop e3, and the first of the pawns fall by way of playing knight on e, taking on d5, which obviously does two things. Not only opens up the path for the rook up to e3, but also the black's pawn is pinned on c4, because there's no ways that black would be able to take on d5 because of the super simple threat down onto the queen by way of the bishop. And in this situation, after this first pawn has fallen and the total disarray of white's pieces, its position is completely hopeless and he can just about resign already. But the game continued with queen takes on f5, the bishop takes on c4, and white resigns, simply because after bishop c4, for instance, white can take the bishop, white bangs down onto with rook e1 check, and what can white, so black bangs down with rook e1 check, and what can white possibly do here? He can go, he's got what, a couple of moves available to him. He can play, for instance, king c2, but then that just means that black drops down with an option of either knight e3 check, or even stronger, in this position black can simply play queen a4 check. And what does queen a4 check do? Queen a4 check is simply a mating combination, because the bishop will drop back to d3, the queen then comes across to c6 check, bishop c4, queen takes c4 check, king d2, queen c1 check, king d3, the rook comes up to e3 check, and after the forced king d4, black then simply comes back with the queen to c5, and that will be checkmate. So dropping back to after rook e1 check, what is the other option that black can possibly do? Would be maybe the strongest between inverted commas, would be to take on e1, but all that happens is black follows up with rook e1 check, king c2, knight e3 check. So what can black do here? He can maybe play The king out to b3, but then the queen falls and it's all over. So with all of those threats, either mating threat or a queen loss, back after bishop takes c4, white Gelfand resigned in this position and Jobava went up for a tie of the lead. So that is how the game was won. Please post your comments and questions down below. Click the like button, little thumbs up, share this out amongst your chess friends, and click the big red subscribe button down below as well. That way you can stay subscribed to my channel and get updates on new games as I post them on a week-to-week basis. Stay carved up for the win. Stay safe out there. See you next time. Cheers.